Good evening. I'm very honored to be here with Vanessa Beeley. I have incredible respect for Vanessa. She is a pioneering investigative journalist that many people are unaware of this. And I will say right now that I'm biased. I have a preference for the truth. I have a preference for truthful reporting. And Vanessa reports the truth. And I am a firm believer that if Canadians knew the truth about what our government and what our governing agencies are doing in Syria to Christians and to Muslims and to the country itself, I'm a firm believer that that truth would lead to very positive changes, and our government would terminate any and all association with this war on Syria. Vanessa is an expert. She uses the truth. She is in Syria when she investigates, unlike the mainstream journalists. Okay, she does not have an agenda apart from the truth and facts. You cannot ascertain the truth if you're not on the ground in Syria. And Vanessa is there. And I've met Vanessa in Syria, and I've seen her work in Syria with Syrians. She's an expert on Syria. She's an expert on the white helmets. She's a pioneering investigative reporter, and she has a number. I will read now what another speaker was going to read. She's been on the ground, as you know, in Syria, but also in Egypt, Iraq, Palestine, while also covering the conflict in Yemen since 2015. In 2017, Vanessa was a finalist for the prestigious Martha Gellhorn Prize for Journalism, which was won by the much acclaimed Robert Perry that year. In 2018, Vanessa was named one of the 238 most respected journalists in the UK by the British National Council for the Training of Journalists. In 2019, Vanessa was among recipients of the Serena Shim Award for uncompromising integrity in journalism. Vanessa contributes regularly to Minpress News, Russia Today, UK Column, The Last American Vagabond, Sputnik Radio, 21st Century Wire, and many other independent media outlets. You can also support her work at her Patreon account. I think we are very, very fortunate to have Melissa here, and I welcome her. Sorry, Vanessa.
No, just once, and I don't know why. Good evening. Can everybody hear me clearly? Thank you very much to the organisers for making this possible, to everyone who allowed us to be here and allowed me to speak. There is usually a wave of vehement opposition to my being able to speak and to anybody else being able to speak who is countering the dominant narrative, which is the establishment narrative on Syria. So I really appreciate this opportunity to speak here. I have a bias. I don't believe in the journalist creed of objectivity, which is what is so often taught in journalist schools and media courses at university these days. I believe as long as a journalist expresses their bias and is very clear about that bias, then the evidence that they produce should not be discounted because of that bias. And I will state very clearly that my bias is that I am against imperialism. I am for international law, the respect of international law, and I'm against the violation of international law. Because without international law, we have a state of global insecurity, which is actually what we have now. And that is thanks to, effectively, the United States and its coalition, and unfortunately, at the moment, I count Canada as part of that coalition. So my focus tonight, although my area of expertise is in actually highlighting what I consider to be the war crimes of my government in the UK against the Syrian people, tonight what I'm going to try to do is to go into some of the investigations that I've done and highlight the fact that Canada is very much financially behind some of these organizations that are effectively maintaining the information war against Syria and its allies. And of course, in my opinion, without this information war, military wars can't be waged. Without the public being duped into believing in another humanitarian war pretext, we wouldn't be seeing these multiple military, either direct or by proxy, military interventions globally. We're seeing them all over the place. We're seeing them in Venezuela, we're seeing them in Chile and Bolivia, we're seeing them in Syria, we've seen them already in Libya and Iraq, even in Egypt, and in a very different format. But these information complexes, as I call them, and they include not only the media, they include the NGOs. I call them the NNGOs, the non-governmental organizations. The think tanks, the UN-related agencies and institutions. So basically what I'm going to do, or try to do, is to cover three of my investigations which kind of link together and show how Canada is effectively working to support these various creations that are fabricating some of the evidence that is being used to criminalize the Syrian government and their allies. Very quickly, just going through them first of all, and then I'll come back to them in more detail. First of all, Hala Systems, which is related to the white helmets. Do I need to go into any big detail about the white helmets? I'll cover them as I go through the presentation, but I'm assuming everybody knows who they are. The OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, recently involved in the investigation of the alleged Syrian chemical attack in Douma in March 2018 in the eastern suburbs of Damascus. And of course, the white helmets. Very quickly, I will just show this image of the white helmets who purport to save all of humanity, to save either regime soldiers or those that support, regime is their terminology, not mine, who claim to help everyone from either side in the conflict, but here is seen showing the victory sign while standing on the bodies of Syrian Arab Army soldiers. So what I'd like to start with is to give you an idea of the purpose of the white helmets. This is a draft document from the British government, from the Conflict Stability and Security Fund, which is what is used to fund many of the organisations both promoting and supporting financially the white helmets, and are also being used to fund the white helmets themselves through the Mayday Rescue Foundation, which you will see there, which received 9 million, or will receive 9 million between the 1st of April 2017 and March 2020. But this is the part of the document that I find particularly interesting. It actually admits in this document that Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have stated that the white helmets, or as they like to call them, the Syria Civil Defence, they are not the Syria Civil Defence. There is an existing Syria Civil Defence that was established inside Syria in 1953, and it's the only civil defence recognised by the International Civil Defence Organisation in Geneva. But they have stated that the white helmets are their most routinely reliable source for reporting. Now, I'm not going to go into any huge depth right now in the sort of revolving door between Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, but we don't have to go very far back to remember that Amnesty International supported the lies that led to the NATO intervention in Libya. They supported the lies that led to NATO intervention in Afghanistan. They supported the incubator story. They supported the weapons of mass destruction. And even more interesting for me is the wording of this statement. Throughout the bombardment by Russia since September 2015, the White Helmets have provided essential corroboration. It's strange wording for me that strikes were not targeting Daesh but moderate opposition entities. So in other words, how I read this document is the White Helmets are providing corroboration for the evidence that the British government needs to underpin its foreign policy in Syria and to allow it to continue with its humanitarian intervention. In September 2018, I was in Dara al-Balad, which is an area or a city to the south of Damascus, which had very recently, I think it was in July, had come under a reconciliation agreement negotiated and brokered by the Russian Amnesty and Reconciliation teams. Areas of the city at this time were still under control of the armed groups who had been allowed to keep their small weapons but had been forced into giving up their heavy weapons. And when I say heavy weapons, I mean extremely heavy weapons, 500 kilo to 1 ton rockets that were fired into civilian areas by these armed groups during their occupation of the city of Dara. During this visit, I literally stumbled on an operating White Helmet Centre, still in the area under the control of the armed groups, although effectively being monitored by Russian reconciliation teams at that time. Now, what immediately became clear to me as I went into the White Helmet Centre is, as we always see with the White Helmets, there is a Nusra Front or an armed group, extremist armed group centre in the same complex with the White Helmets, and that was no different in Dara al-Balad. What was interesting was when I entered the centre, and bear in mind these were White Helmets still working, still operating alongside the armed groups. I was introduced as an independent journalist from Britain, at which point they immediately started to tell me that they hadn't received any funding from the British government for 6 months. So perhaps I could report back to the British government and get the funding tap turned back on. Sorry?
And just all the twists, please, sir, can we have some more?
If you have any questions, I suggest you write them down at the end. A British registered fire engine. The next image that I'm going to show, although I've pixelated it out, it might be quite distressing. These were Syrian Arab army soldiers who were massacred at an airbase just south of Dara al-Balad. I have written an entire investigative article on this. As I said, I can't go into huge detail on everything as part of this presentation. But their bodies, we actually tracked where they were brought on the way back from the airbase where they were massacred by the armed groups. At this time, the armed groups were working effectively alongside Nusra Front, which is Al-Qaeda in this area. And the majority of these armed groups, this has been admitted by Israel recently, were also being supplied weapons by Israel, as well as hospital and medical treatment. These bodies were basically dismembered. Witnesses told me and Eva Bartlett that their bodies were dismembered, the body parts were put into plastic bags by the White Helmet operatives, and they were put on the rubbish tip. Here we have a White Helmet operative. This video was shown on Twitter and various other sites, clambering over the bodies of the prisoners of war, Syrian Arab army soldiers, And you'll see in this image, again I've pixelated it out, you'll see the armed group members holding up the severed head and basically parading it around with the white helmet operative present. Now the white helmets themselves put out a statement saying that their operative was not behaving according to the rules of the White Helmet organization. He was sacked. I mean, the reason that I emphasize the word sacked is that were any member of the Red Cross or the Syrian Arab Red Crescent or any other alleged humanitarian organization found to be performing this kind of crime, I mean, this is a war crime against Geneva Convention, this is a war crime. He would be investigated and the organization would be investigated, not simply a statement put out that he's been sacked, so everything is okay. Now, one of the interesting statements that the leader of this White Helmet organization told me, not only did he tell me that the White Helmets that were evacuated by Israel in July of 2018 had among them many members of both ISIS and Nusra Front. And they were safely evacuated through Israel and into Jordan for resettlement in various countries, both in the EU and Canada. But what he made the point that many of the other groups, not his group, of White Helmets would have Nusra Front connections. If a leader of the White Helmets were Nusra Front, then you could safely say that all the other members of that White Helmet group would also be Nusra Front. Now, what is interesting is that Al-Mahamid's group, I found previous videos which show a very clear connection with their leadership, with the Free Syrian Army, the so-called moderate opposition. But I just want to give you a reminder of who the moderate opposition was in 2013.
كيف هي علاقتك مع دولة الإسلام في العراق والشام؟
جيد. أنا علاقتي مع
تتواصل معهم؟
بالتأكيد تواصل شبه يومي أنا والأخوة في دولة العراق.
يقال بأن
لحل هذه الخلافات وحل هذه المشاكل الأمور فيها تهويل إعلامي كبير، فيها تسليط ضوء كبير جدا على موضوع دولة العراق والشام وبأنهم تكفيريين حقيقة
هم ليسوا كذلك؟
القسم الأكبر منهم ليسوا كذلك. يوجد البعض منهم من العناصر ربما لديهم فكر خاطئ، ولكن عندما نجلس معهم
أخطاء فردية إذا
ربما أخطاء فردية، ولكن عندما نجلس مع قياداتهم حقيقة لا يوجد لديهم هذا الفكر وتكون العلاقة جيدة وحتى أخوية، ولكن بعض التصرفات على الأرض هناك أخطاء، وهذا شيء طبيعي أن يكون أخطاء عند الدولة وأخطاء عندنا وأخطاء عند الألوية وأخطاء كل من يعمل فهو يخطئ، وربما بعض الأفراد منهم لديهم أفكار خاطئة يكفرون ويتكلمون
لكن لا يمثل
ولكن حقيقة
أو قيادة
لا أدري ولم أشفق على صدرهم لأعلم بأن هذا هو فكر قادتهم أو هم من يعلمون هؤلاء الأفراد أم هو ذا تصرف شخصي من الأفراد.
الحمد لله رب العالمين، الحمد لله، الحمد لله. نشكر الجميع، نشكر الله سبحانه وتعالى ونزف هذه البشرى لأهلنا في سوريا ولأهلنا المسلمين في جميع أنحاء العالم بأننا الله أكرمنا في هذا الشهر الفضيل بهذا النصر العظيم بعد أن حققنا النصر في منطقة خان العسل والآن في مطار منغ العسكري الذي تحرر على يد هؤلاء الأبطال. الله أكبر ولله الحمد، الله أكبر ولله الحمد. تكبير، الله أكبر، تكبير.
This is Madik Citadel, Khalat al-Madik, which was fairly recently liberated by the Syrian Arab Army in northern Hama. I spent considerable time in the Syrian Christian towns of Mahadeh and Al-Skelbiyeh. In fact, this photo was taken literally 400 meters from this building, sat in a restaurant in Al-Skelbiyeh. And that night, more than 16 mortars were fired into Al-Skelbiyeh, targeting residential areas. I was there when the rockets came in. One landed about 10 meters away from where I was. They weren't targeting military positions, they were targeting civilian positions. This year in May, 5 children were martyred in Skelbier by rockets that came in and hit the monastery, which is on top of a hill in Skelbier, and which is used as a community centre and a school. The White Helmets were in the building that you can see there, which are old wheat silos. Their centre was underground above were the extremist factions, which at that point were being led by Nusra Front or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, one of the rebrands of Al-Qaeda. I entered Qalat al-Madiq about 1 month after liberation, and clearly the White Helmet sign is showing. So again, the White Helmets were operating in an area that was effectively held by terrorist and extremist groups. And in fact, the White Helmets that were there, I was told, had come in, many of them had come in from the eastern suburbs, eastern Ghouta, the eastern suburbs of Damascus, when they were evacuated in the green buses with the terrorist factions. In Aleppo, after liberation by the Syrian Arab Army of the eastern areas of Aleppo, which again were occupied for almost 5 years by a number of extremist militant groups, sectarian militant groups, again dominated by Nusra Front or Al-Qaeda. Abdulaziz Maghribi, who is circled in the center there, and here he's with a group of Abu Amara. Abu Amara were effectively the protection group for Nusra Front. They were known to be some of the most violent, brutal extremists operating in East Aleppo. He was a member of the Al-Tawid Brigade when they first invaded East Aleppo in 2012, financed and controlled by Turkey. He later joined Abu Amara and Nusra Front. He was always armed, always a militant. He was the head of the White Helmets in East Aleppo, but he was also elected as government of one of the local councils in East Aleppo. Now, why is this interesting? Because when I was in East Aleppo and I was going through the rubble of all the old White Helmet centres, the old Nusra Front centres, and again, that's where I started to remark how the White Helmets and Nusra Front almost always worked side by side or shared buildings. I interviewed locals, children up to adults, who described how the White Helmets participated in capturing people for either execution or for torture or for detainment and imprisonment. But what was really interesting is we came across documents sort of buried in all the stuff that the White Helmets had actually tried to burn. And then amongst that, we found papers from 2 companies, Integrity Global Consulting and Adam Smith International. And through that, I managed to trace through that and other papers that we found to the fact that the British government was effectively giving money through the Conflict Stability and Security Fund to these 2 organisations to create local councils in areas held by the extremist groups as a sort of shadow state construct in competition with the elected and internationally recognised Syrian government. So effectively, when we look at the pedigree of someone like Abdulaziz Maghribi and his connection to Nusra Front, effectively the British government was using public funds. The Conflict Stability and Security Fund is a 1 billion public fund, slush fund, used to promote security globally. So effectively they were giving funds from this financing entity to Al-Qaeda, directly to Al-Qaeda. And please remember what Al-Mahmoud said, that if the leader of a group of White Helmets is Nusra Front, then we can assume that the majority of the members of that White Helmet group will also be Nusra Front. Now, I did mention the billionaire complex who are promoting and supporting and protecting the White Helmet construct. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail tonight because it's going to just take way too much time. But there is a series of articles at Mint Press News that I wrote with award-winning journalist Whitney Webb. 3 articles. Professor Piers Robinson, who is convener of the Academic Working Group on Syria, Propaganda and Media, and I'll be referring to them again in my notes on the OPCW later on in the presentation. But he makes the very clear statement that understanding the way in which power is exercised in democracies requires careful and detailed exploration of power networks. That's what I was talking about the networks that are behind not only the White Helmets, but behind all of the organizations that are effecting and sustaining the regime change war against Syria. In the contemporary world, these involve relationships between state actors, political movements, think tanks in particular, business interests, and also popular culture and celebrity politics. Part of modern-day propaganda operations aimed at mobilization of bias involve power, political and economic actors co-opting media and popular culture celebrities in order to promote particular worldviews, shape public understanding, and to achieve concrete political outcomes. One of these articles that I want to focus on, however, is the one which covers the fact that Yugoslavia, or former Yugoslavia, the Balkans, was very much seen as a blueprint for the operation that has been led against Syria since actually before 2011, but it effectively started in 2011. You may all have heard of James Le Mesurier, former British military intelligence and founder of the White Helmets, who on the 11th of November this year was found dead in Istanbul. Again, I've just finished the first part of an investigation into his mysterious death, how the media covered it, the difference between the reporting in the Turkish media compared to the British media, for example, and also looking at some of the financial dealings of Mayday Rescue, the organization that he set up almost 1 year to the day after he founded the White Helmets in Turkey and Jordan in 2013. He then established Mayday Rescue in 2014 to basically act as an intermediary between the British government and the White Helmets. But effectively, he was still managing the White Helmets as Mayday Rescue. In fact, they shared a building in Istanbul, the 2 organizations. But why am I relating this to Kosovo? Because I believe this is a very important element of the role of the White Helmets in Syria now. I'll go through this very quickly. You can read it if you need any more information. It's both in the article, and I can give anyone who needs it a copy of the presentation. But basically, the most important aspect of James Le Mesurier's career and his time in Kosovo was in 1999. He was working in Pristina in Kosovo under the directorship of Bernard Kouchner. Now, some of you may not know, but Bernard Kouchner was accused of knowingly supporting the operations of cross-border organ trafficking by the Kosovo Liberation Army. Mesurier was working with the KLA, which at that point was made up of elements of Al-Qaeda and Albanian warlords. He was working on their remodeling into the Kosovo Security Corps at the same time as they were conducting cross-border organ trafficking operations. There is a book by Carla Del Ponte on the subject. I can't remember the title right now. But I can give it to anyone who needs it afterwards. Not the book, the title. She met with a huge amount of opposition in her investigation, but nevertheless she managed to conduct the investigation and the book was written. Maxim Grigoriev of the Foundation for the Study of Democracy made his first presentation, and I was actually included in that presentation in the UN in New York, where he presented the results of, I think, almost 18 months of investigation inside Syria, interviewing former White Helmets, interviewing people that had lived alongside the White Helmets or even worked with the White Helmets, not as White Helmets, but worked alongside them. And what is interesting, and again, this is something that I've also borne witness to, in the sense that I've received testimony from civilians that they believe the White Helmets were involved in organ trafficking. In East Aleppo, people told me that they were basically the runners. They would take the bodies from East Aleppo to the border with Turkey, where they would be inspected by doctors. Those that were suitable for organ transplant that would then be taken on into Turkish hospitals. But a chapter in his book, and this book is available as a PDF, so again, if anybody would like the link, please contact me after the presentation. But as you can see, part 4 of his book, Organ Harvesting and the Stealing of Valuables from Syrian Citizens, Theft Within the Organization. I highly recommend this book. Please don't see it as Russian disinformation. The majority of the evidence against the White Helmets comes from the Syrian people. I give their voices a platform. Russian media outlets give their voices a platform. As you know, after the Duma alleged attack, the narrative is now virtually discredited completely. The Russians gave voice to the witnesses who said it was not a chemical attack. You can't dismiss all of these voices as Russian disinformation. They are Syrian voices and they deserve to be heard. Now I come to the Canada bit. So let's see what Canada thinks about the White Helmets. First of all, Christian Freeland. The White Helmets are courageous volunteers. First of all, they are not volunteers. They actually get paid a minimum wage, over $150 a month, which is 3 times the amount that a Syrian Arab Army soldier receives. And that's a basic worker. As you go up, again, when I was in East Aleppo, we found dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of wage slips and pay slips. So I know exactly what members of the White Helmets were receiving. They were not volunteers. Sorry?
Hired mercenaries.
And so basically she's saying they're first responders. Again, I would question this. A number of urban search and rescue experts have questioned their paramedic actions when they see it on video. And I'll show that at the end of the presentation. At this point, Christian Freeland was thanking Israel, Jordan, US, UK and Germany and our other partners who've worked closely with Canada to make the evacuation of White Helmets possible. Basically, Canada was kind of the mastermind behind the Israeli evacuation of White Helmets from the south of Syria. And as I've already pointed out, and the evidence is out there, that certain leaders and members of armed groups were evacuated at the same time. And as has also been made clear, the former chief of the IDF has said quite clearly that Israel was arming and supporting the armed groups. So I'm not actually sure if there's been an update on the 4.5 million that was given to the White Helmets in 2016, but however, Canada is or was financially supporting them. Former Justice Minister and General Attorney Owen Kotler nominated the White Helmets for their 3rd nomination for a Nobel Peace Prize. Again, I would recommend that everyone reads the amazing Eve Engler's reports on Owen Kotler to get a far more in-depth idea of who this pseudo-humanitarian really is, and I say that very strongly. This is a virulently pro-Zionist, anti-Palestine activist who calls himself a humanitarian. Now, interestingly, what he focuses on, and again, what a lot of people will focus on with the white helmets, was that, okay, they might have mopped up after a few executions, they might have been seen dismembering Syrian Arab army corpses, they might have been seen, you know, participating in extrajudiciary executions of civilians, but hey, never mind, they've saved more than 100,000 civilians. I'm going to question that very shortly. As I mentioned about Owen Kotler, I think what is interesting is not only his record of being anti-Palestine, but also strongly pro-NATO intervention. He's a strong advocate of the R2P doctrine, the responsibility to protect, which of course is used to justify many of the illegal interventions that we see, I call it the US alliance, proceeding with globally. But what is also interesting for me is Kotler's connections, for example, to someone like Alan Dershowitz. Dershowitz is actually sort of literally called Kotler's twin in the media. And of course, Dershowitz has a history of defending Epstein in 2008. He reduced his sentence down then after he'd been basically prosecuted for paedophilia. Dershowitz is arguing for the reduction in the age of consent. I don't think that needs any other comment. He also basically argues for state-sanctioned torture. He suggests that the state should be allowed to use certain acceptable forms of torture against suspects that are suspected of terrorist activities, etc. It's a very, very dangerous path to go down. But these are the kind of supporters of the white helmets that we have. Pro-Zionist, Zionist, effectively, and with the connections that Kotler has and the causes that he promotes. This gives a very strong indication of how important the white helmets are to Israel. And then let's come on to the claims that the white helmets have saved 115,000 lives. Mike King is not just any sort of Twitter commentator. He's an author, he's a historian. And what he's actually done, I've got the files that he sent me. He's archived more than 4,354 tweets of the white helmets. And this is what he's actually analysed. They had documented only 625 rescues until the end of October 2019, of which only 88 are supported by plausible video evidence, of which only 9 are named, of which 3 have surnames. What is extraordinary is this group's been given over $200 million, and yet they're incapable of recording and documenting the incidents that they supposedly attend and the families that they rescue. And I will also question, why are there no interviews with thankful civilians thanking the white helmets for the rescues of their relatives or family members? You see them all the time regarding the Red Cross or regarding the Syrian Arab Red Crescent in the 85% of Syria that is now back under the protection of the Syrian government. What's also interesting is if you go back to the initial document that I showed you, where it states that the white helmets corroborate the reports or they are a reliable resource for entities like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. But they're also tasked by the British government in particular to document war crimes. But what is extraordinary here, there appears to only be one belligerent in this war, which is Assad. Again, in 4,354 tweets, they've mentioned ISIS only 18 times, the Free Syrian Army 3 times, Nusra Front, which is Al-Qaeda, once. And you can see Jaish al-Islam 0, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham 0. Now, with Jaish al-Islam, which was one of the most brutal extremist elements in eastern Ghouta, controlling Douma where the alleged chemical weapon attack took place, This organization was recognized even by other extremist groups as one of the most tyrannical groups inside Syria. They were involved in the Adra massacre in 2013, where Syrian civilians, Alawites, were basically burned alive in the huge bread furnaces in Adra. Thousands of others were kidnapped and were held in the Tauba prison in Douma, which I actually visited, where they were tortured, where they were used for chemical experiments. I have numbers of testimonies from civilians who attest to that. And yet, you can see here, the White Helmets didn't document one single crime by this organization, nor by Al-Qaeda. I mean, this is extraordinary. If this organization is being given $200 million plus all the public donations that they're given in order to inform us about the war crimes in Syria, I'll leave you to think about that. And even more interesting, I can't read that, it's too small. Somebody put in a freedom of information request to actually ask about the numbers of rescues that is constantly given to us by government officials, by the UN, by think tanks, by NGOs, by the entire complex supporting the White Helmets. So basically what the British government responded, in response to your first question, the most recent figure we hold of those rescued is 114,507. That was on the 22nd of April 2018. Bear in mind that the British government is the primary financier of this group, and yet it does not hold information on the breakdown by province or area of those rescued. So clearly the documentation is not being upheld. On your third question, Foreign Office officials do not visit Syria to inspect the documentation or to view Syria civil defence activities, the White Helmet activities. Her Majesty's government maintains channels of communication with a broad range of analysts, NGOs and media personnel. So it's not primary information. And this engagement informs the design and adaptation of civil defence programmes. They talk about a strong donor network which shares information, but again, I will disprove that, about emerging risks and mitigations. In addition to the above, our implementing partner contracts an independent monitor to verify whether goods and services are reaching intended beneficiaries and used for the purpose intended. Now, the implementing partner is Mayday Rescue. In 2018, the Dutch government withdrew funding from Mayday Rescue because it couldn't guarantee that the finances were not going to the terrorist groups and the extremist groups inside Syria. So the British government is basically omitting that information. Then, extraordinarily, it says we meet regularly with our implementing partner and the White Helmets. So they meet regularly with Mayday Rescue and the White Helmets. They attend the White Helmets annual general meeting and visit White Helmet training, which is in Turkey, not in Syria. So this is kind of a very cozy, closed loop information here. The British government is funding Mayday Rescue. Mayday Rescue is financing and managing the White Helmets, and they all meet once a year to decide what information they're going to give to the public. That's how I interpret it. These are the White Helmets in Idlib 2015. What they're actually saying is, long live Jaish al-Fatah. Jaish al-Fatah, the army of conquest, I believe. As we know, in Idlib, even Brett McGurk has stated that this is the largest Al-Qaeda haven since 9/11. Jaish al-Fatah is basically an alliance of terrorist and extremist groups led by Sheikh Abdullah Mohaizani, who's a Riyadh-educated and financed fanatic cleric who is documented to be training child suicide bombers. He's carried out, or the groups under his command have carried out some of the most heinous atrocities against the Syrian people, particularly against minorities, such as the Alawites, the Shia, the Christians, the Jews, etc. Another very important point that I want to make, that just made me think of it, is if I look at the real Syria Civil Defense, which was established in 1953, every group of this organization comprises of every single minority group inside Syria, as does the Syrian army, as does almost every institution in what I call free Syria, the Syria that is free from these armed groups. The White Helmet does not include any single minority sect, not one. They are all made up of what I would term extremist Sunni Muslim. They do not include Shia, they do not include Christians, they do not include any other minority sect. This is not Syria. This does not represent Syria. This does not reflect the Syrian society that I know and I love. White helmets have also been honoured and given awards by Al-Qaeda. Here we have a compilation of 3 videos. It will play. The previous ones, they were given awards and praised by Sheikh Abdullah Mahizani and also by Abu Jabba, who was a former leader of HTS or Al-Qaeda.
على قائمة أهم الأهداف للطيران الاحتلال الروسي مواقعهم فيقصفون ثم تجدهم يذهبون يعني مسافة قريبة من موقعهم ثم يعودون إليه قبل أن ينقشع حتى غبار القذائف التي تنهال عليهم.
So this is in August 2019. Please remember again that Idlib is the largest Al-Qaeda haven since 9/11. And here you have the leader of Al-Qaeda, Abu Muhammad al-Julani, praising his partners in the White Helmets. Now what he also mentions is the White Helmets provide an early warning system for them, so for Al-Qaeda, so that they know when there are incoming flights. Why is this important? Because Canada is funding Hala Systems. Hala Systems is the early warning system that was developed in collaboration with the White Helmets to provide an early warning signal of incoming airstrikes from Russia and from Syria against, this is my interpretation, against terrorist enclaves and facilities, ammunition dumps, military centers, etc. So basically you have Abu Muhammad al-Julani, the leader of Al-Qaeda, thanking the White Helmets for their work, thanking them for providing the early warning system. You have Canada and other governments funding Hala Systems, who developed, and Hala Systems comprises former members of the US State Department, former members of US military, Air Force, Navy, CIA-connected organizations, etc. And they basically developed the Hala Systems network, which enables the White Helmets, who they worked in collaboration with, to provide early warning for the terrorist groups of incoming airstrikes. Here you can see among the funding partners, Global Affairs Canada, and alongside the British Foreign Office. So in my opinion, and that is taken from the article that you can read at Mint Press News, the White Helmets are a militarized intelligence PSYOP agency working for NATO member states to criminalize the Syrian government. They certainly don't criminalize any other belligerent in Syria, and allies, and operating alongside terrorist groups also supported by those same belligerent nations led by the UK and the US. Now, I don't know how much time I've got. I'm going to come very quickly on to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. the fact that Canada not only supports them financially, they are pushing very hard alongside France, Britain and the United States for the OPCW to be given the mandate to attribute blame. No prizes for guessing who would be blamed, of course. This gives a breakdown from the NTI review that Canada donated 18.7 million Canadian dollars to the OPCW for chemical weapons disposal efforts in Syria between 2012 and 2015. Canada is proud to be a top donor to OPCW's work on Syria, and we stand for accountability for the use of chemical weapons. I wonder when they're going to investigate the US coalition use of depleted uranium in Syria. Of course, when the Duma alleged attack happened in March 2018, and I was in Damascus when it happened, the days prior to that, I'd actually been taken to the areas that were recently liberated. I'd entered chemical storage facilities belonging to the armed groups. Now, I have to actually say that Frederick Pleitgen of CNN was with me on those tours. We actually went together. Yet when he reported on the Duma alleged chemical attack in March, he omitted to say that that very day he'd been to visit facilities that were under the control of the armed groups and that contained huge numbers of chemicals, whether they were organophosphates or chlorine, etc. But we saw the facilities together. Of course, Russia again was condemned for taking a number of doctors who said that there was no evidence of a chemical attack. They said that there had simply been the effects of a normal shelling attack during the Syrian army campaign to liberate those areas, and that people had come in suffering